Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I am the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the alternative notations digest that's in the foreword to the performance score. Now, here's the section called Alternative Notations in the Parts. This was not present in the initial iteration of the score. The foreword went from about 17 pages to about 43 pages. And this section was one of the sections that was added. And it was added specifically because Peter Etfish saw that there were alternative notations in the parts. That's indicated in the survival guide, but he explained that he really needed to see them so that he could know whether or not he could rely on them or not, and asked for the parts to be brought to him so that he could look at them. And I realized, well, this is ridiculous. This needs to be presented so conductors can see them and then, adjust their conducting technique accordingly. So I went through and made this compendium, this digest, and these are the salient ones. These are the ones that Gunther Schuller in particular felt needed to be added to the score to help players. I am not a fan of all of them, and I've tried to reconcile my feeling that this needs to be put into the score because Schuller has conducted the piece many times and understood that there were passages that needed this kind of attention, but I wasn't convinced that all of them were really that helpful. So my solution was whenever I would put in an alternative notation, I would always present Ives' original notation. It would never be without it. And then the decision had to be made whether to put the alternative notation on the top, which would be closer to the tempo indications and so on, or to put it on the bottom, which is just removed from it. And so this is where I made a judgment call. I decided whichever notation was the one that was more likely to be read by the player should be the one that should be on the top staff in all cases. And I interviewed players and checked with them, and I was right, it seemed, almost every single time. One of the ones that I feel is in fact justified is the very first one in this listing, which is the trumpet call at the beginning of the first movement. Because in the original notation, it's 2 quartuplets in the time of 3 quarters within the 6/4, but with internal triplets within the quartuplets, which is just fiendishly difficult to calculate. But it works out that it's actually not that difficult. When you renotate it, you're basically just reading 16ths and 8ths. And every trumpet player I talked with said that they read from the alternative notation because it was just too hard to try to figure out what a triplet within a quartuplet of a triplet really equaled. So that one I feel is quite valuable. In this section that I call the Battle of the Triplets, I put in this alternative notation for the violas and the instruments who are playing the triplet pattern off by an eighth. And there were some conductors who felt that it would be easier to play from, but most players, I think, actually preferred just reading Ives' original and playing it off the beat. And most that I talked with said that that was the one that they were reading, and that the other form was just a little tricky to negotiate. Also within that section, the other group that's doing triplets off the beat involves the trumpets and the clarinets. And the alternative notation looks like Fernie-Howe. I mean, I just don't understand how anyone could read it and play it in tempo, sitting down for a rehearsal on a Tuesday, never having looked at this part before. It's there. I don't think anybody used it in concert. I even put alternative notation for practice. In my commentary, I think I even state that it's not likely that it would be used, but there it is. This one, there are some nested triplets within the cellos and the bassoons, where they're doing a large triplet and then a triplet within a triplet, and this is in the second movement. And this is something that Gunther felt needed to be respelled with this sort of analytical notation. And I don't know of any player who actually felt that this was an easier thing to read. I think most of them just looked at the large triplets and played it. In fact, many of them told me this. So there it is. All right, this one, this renotation of this bell part where it's playing triplets that are offset by an eighth, was renotated as you see it on the top staff in the 1965 score. So all I've done is reproduce what was already there in 65. But I think the player should really see what the original notation looked like, because in the renotated form, it's kind of hard to understand that this just sounds like a dum, ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum, bum. Because if you listen to recordings of the old edition, you can hear players not really getting it. It doesn't sound like a very flowing large triplet. So I put the renotation on top, but I feel that this original notation is good to be present so they can see what the affected rhythm really does sound like. Going on to the next one. This is in measure 59 and the fourth movement, where all the violins and the flutes and clarinets are playing in 3/2 against the rest of the orchestra. And usually a second conductor conducts this. But it occurred to me, this is something where it might be good to include a renotation into 4, which is what the rest of the orchestra is reading and how it's being conducted by the main conductor. So I provided this analytical renotation in 4 here, and I've tried to distinguish between the two of them. With all these tied notes, it's hard to read, but it's there. The players that I interviewed about this said which staff they read depended upon which conductor was in their line of sight. Those who said they could more easily see the conductor who was conducting in 4 read from this staff. And those who could see the conductor who was conducting in 3 would read from the other staff. So this one turned out to be worthwhile putting in because people were using it and they were benefiting from it. This is a renotation of this flute passage when the Mr. Smooth It Away theme is sounded in the second movement. I think it should be helpful to most players. They seemed to be helped by both versions. And then here at the top, there is a bell part. There's a place where there's a tricky subdivision where in the bells, it's playing a quartuplet in the time of 5/8 within a 3/4 bar. So the original notation is put in along with the renotation. And it seemed to help players make sense of how the rhythm is to sound. Finally, here's a passage in the collapse section where in the second movement, the flute is provided with this little birdsong trill that it's playing, these little triplets. And Ives himself spells out what he's really intending for these grace note figures that have internal rhythms. And if you read through what he is saying about how it should be executed, it works out that he's talking about a notation like this. So I put that on top because that's really what he's getting at. And it's not really that hard to read. But I provided the original notation as well. And the flute players I interviewed about this said they sort of went back and forth between reading the original notation and the renotation. And that may be due to how the conductor was conducting and how they were initially reading the passage when they were first going through it. I'm not certain, but they were saying they sort of went back and forth between the two. At any rate, those are really all the tricky rhythms that seem to, at least to Gunther, and then some to me, needed to be presented in 2 forms. And so they're all provided in this digest that was added to the forward to the score so that conductors can look and see what's there and then figure out if they need to do anything when they're conducting to adjust their technique to accommodate whichever version the players might be reading. And in fact, there were some conductors who would say, oh, please read from the renotated notation here. So they would, in fact, make use of it in that way. So it's a valuable addition to the edition, I believe.